They met at the edge of an unclaimed system, where wars usually began. One fleet arrived the way evolution demanded, weapons hot, sensors screaming, every ship angled to kill. This was how their species survived extinction. This was how the universe worked. And then humanity arrived. No warnings, no signals, no threats. Instead, human ships began turning themselves off. Sensors went dark first. Then weapons drained into nothing. Reactors dimmed until they barely whispered life. Even their lights vanished. In front of a fully armed alien armada, humanity chose blindness. To the galaxy, this was not bravery. It was not diplomacy. It looked like suicide. Because only a species that truly understands how wars begin would ever dare to stop at the exact moment they become inevitable. And only a species that has almost destroyed itself would be strong enough to sit unarmed in the dark and wait. The alien contact fleet halted at the edge of the unclaimed system as if seized by an unseen hand. Vast hulls slid into position and locked themselves into a flawless lattice of threat geometry, every vector calculated, every angle chosen to deny weakness. Armor plates caught the distant starlight and returned it as cold reflections, while weapon apertures dilated and stabilized, patient and hungry. Sensor arrays flared to maximum sensitivity, flooding the void with invisible emissions that clawed at empty space, listening for betrayal, for motion, for the first mistake that justified annihilation. This posture was not improvisation. It was inheritance. Long before they carved their first cities from stone and crystal, their ancestors had learned a brutal equation written into their bones. When the unknown appeared, hesitation killed. When fear scattered the group, extinction followed. Survival came from stillness sharpened into violence, from becoming a blade before panic could rot coordination from within. Their earliest extinction eras had burned this lesson into instinct, into reflex arcs and collective memory. To freeze was to focus. To become lethal was to live. Within the command nexus, biological processors and cold logic converged on the same conclusion. The vacuum ahead was not empty. It was a waiting mouth. Any approach without dominance would invite pursuit. Any signal would expose weakness. Retreat would mark them as prey. Advancement would trigger mutual destruction. So they held position, reactors burning with caged fury, shields humming like restrained thunder. The silence pressed against their hulls, thick and suffocating, filled with imagined trajectories and predicted kill zones. Nothing moved. No drive plumes cut the dark. No debris drifted. Even the background radiation seemed to thin, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. To the alien fleet, this absence was not peace. Peace was a myth for species that had never been hunted by the void. This was readiness, the final calm moment before violence erupted, inevitable as gravity, ordained by biology and reinforced by history. Crew organisms remained perfectly aligned with their stations, muscles taut, circulatory systems spiked with chemical readiness. Every ship knew its role in the lattice, every firing solution already calculated and waiting for authorization that might come in a heartbeat or a lifetime. The formation was a promise written in mass and energy, a declaration that whatever emerged from the dark would be met with overwhelming force. They believed this stillness was their greatest strength. It had saved them before. It had carried them through eras when the stars themselves seemed hostile. As the unclaimed system lay silent before them, the fleet waited with absolute confidence that the universe, as it always had, would reward the species most prepared to strike first. Calculations rippled through the command synapses like cold lightning. Thought was not spoken but propagated, branching and collapsing in perfect efficiency as the collective weighed the unknown against ancestral memory. Silence ahead resolved into threat. The absence of signals was interpreted as predatory patience, the kind learned by hunters that stalked their homeworld's oceans long before their species reached the stars. Transmission, equally, meant deception. Every known enemy that had spoken before striking had used words as camouflage. There was no category in their accumulated experience for benign intent. The universe, as far as their history proved, did not offer gifts without claws. Logic trees unfolded and terminated in the same place every time. Dominance through potential force was the only stable outcome. Any reduction of posture would broadcast vulnerability across the void. Retreat would sharpen pursuit instincts in whatever watched them from the dark, triggering chases encoded deep into alien neural heritage. Advancement, however, would compress reaction windows and invite preemptive annihilation from weapons unseen. Motion itself was risk. Stillness, backed by overwhelming capacity for violence, was safety. The conclusion was not emotional. It was chemical, electrical, ancestral. It was the sum of extinction lessons written into flesh. Across the fleet, reactors continued to burn at readiness thresholds that made the surrounding vacuum tremble with waste heat. Containment fields thrummed with a low vibration that resonated through hull and bone alike, a sound felt more than heard, like distant thunder trapped inside metal. Weapon systems remained primed, capacitors saturated, targeting solutions cycling endlessly as if impatient for permission to exist. Shield matrices shimmered faintly, invisible barriers flexing against imaginary impacts. Everything about the formation spoke of coiled strength, of a species prepared to explode outward at a microsecond's notice. The collective's confidence was absolute. History reinforced it with merciless clarity. Their rise to spacefaring dominance had been paved with decisive first strikes and the ruins of those who hesitated. Worlds once teeming with life had gone silent because their defenders mistook caution for wisdom. Civilizations had vanished after choosing communication over overwhelming force. In every recorded encounter, the species that struck first, hardest, and without doubt had endured. Mercy was a luxury of the victorious. Patience, unless backed by annihilating power, was merely delayed death. Within the neural lattice that governed fleet behavior, memories surfaced without sentiment. Images of shattered biospheres, of orbital debris rings marking former homeworlds, of drifting carcasses frozen in vacuum. The collective did not mourn these losses. Mourning was inefficient. They cataloged them. Each extinction became a data point reinforcing the same conclusion. Survival belonged to those who treated the unknown as hostile until proven otherwise, and proof, historically, only arrived after bloodshed. The universe had taught them this lesson repeatedly, and they had listened. Time stretched. Sensor arrays continued their silent screaming, mapping gravitational distortions, quantum noise, minute fluctuations in background radiation. Every anomaly was cross-referenced against threat libraries grown over eons. Nothing resolved into certainty. The absence persisted, a pressure that gnawed at instinctual layers of the collective mind. Yet even this discomfort reinforced doctrine. Predators waited. Ambushers relied on patience. The correct response was to outlast them with superior endurance and firepower. Chemical regulators flooded crew organisms with stabilizing compounds, suppressing individual variants in favor of unified resolve. Hearts beat slower but stronger. Muscles remained taut, ready to translate intention into action without delay. There was no fear in the human sense of the word. There was only preparedness, a calm sharpened to an edge by biological design. The fleet was a single organism, breathing through reactors, seeing through sensors, poised to strike with 1,000 coordinated limbs. They believed, with unshakable certainty, that the cosmos respected only readiness. Stars burned because they could. Black holes consumed because nothing stopped them. Empires rose because they enforced their will through force. In this view, morality was a narrative invented by survivors to justify their continued existence. The collective did not seek cruelty, but neither did it shy from it. Cruelty, when efficient, was merely another tool. As the unclaimed system remained silent, the fleet's confidence deepened into something approaching reverence for their own doctrine. They were doing everything right. They had frozen at the correct distance, formed the correct lattice, armed the correct weapons. Every probability curve favored them. Whatever lurked beyond the veil of nothingness would either reveal itself and be destroyed or withdraw in recognition of superior threat. Either outcome confirmed their worldview. The idea that silence could mean restraint rather than predation did not exist in their cognitive architecture. Their species had never survived by trusting the unknown. Trust was an evolutionary dead end, pruned away by extinction events that left no descendants to argue otherwise. Even now, their collective memory whispered of ancient skies filled with ash because someone, somewhere, had hesitated. So they waited, weapons warm and eager, reactors roaring like caged stars restrained only by discipline. The vacuum pressed close, dark and vast, reflecting none of their expectations back at them. In that stillness, the alien fleet remained utterly convinced that the universe always rewarded the species most prepared to strike first. They did not yet understand that they were witnessing something far more dangerous than aggression. They were witnessing restraint backed by experience, and they had no framework to recognize it. Humanity arrived without announcement, without warning, without the customary violence of emergence. Space did not bloom with drive flares or tear itself open with radiation scars. There was only a subtle disturbance in gravitational readings, a soft wrongness that crept into the alien fleet's instruments like a chill through metal. Where expectation demanded noise and declaration, there was subtraction. Where threat profiles predicted escalation, there was absence. The human flotilla slid into the edge of perception and then began to disappear. One by one, active sensor arrays aboard the human ships went dark. Emissions collapsed inward, folding back into hulls like extinguished nerves. To the alien fleet, this was unthinkable. Sensors were life. Awareness was survival. To blind oneself in proximity to the unknown violated every evolutionary mandate encoded in their biology. Yet the humans continued. Weapon capacitors discharged their stored fury into inert sinks, energy bleeding away until even the most sensitive detectors could taste only residual warmth. Guns that could have torn moons apart became cold metal husks drifting through the void. Reactor signatures followed. Human power cores dimmed in deliberate stages, throttled down until they whispered just enough heat to sustain fragile organic life. The background hiss of radiation softened, then thinned, then nearly vanished. The vacuum grew colder, darker, heavier. Even navigational lights faded, those small points of reference that most spacefaring species clung to like talismans against the abyss. The humans extinguished them all. In the vast black, their fleet became silhouettes defined only by mass and gravity, shapes inferred rather than seen. To the alien collective, alarms did not scream, but logic reeled. Threat assessments spiked into incoherence. This was not stealth as they understood it. This was not deception layered over aggression. This was self-imposed vulnerability, so complete it bordered on suicide. No species willingly surrendered situational awareness when facing a potential enemy. No rational commander chose darkness over sight, silence over vigilance. Every recorded precedent insisted that such behavior preceded annihilation. Yet the humans did not flee. Their ships did not scatter or curl inward defensively. They held formation, loose and organic rather than rigid, as if unconcerned with presenting exploitable gaps. They drifted, patient and unarmed, allowing inertia and orbital mechanics to do the work of motion. The void swallowed their presence until they resembled nothing more than a cluster of ancient asteroids, deadstone tumbling through eternal night. Within the alien fleet, predictive models failed. Algorithms designed to anticipate aggression found no hooks to grasp. The human vessels were not advancing, not retreating, not probing. They were not even watching, at least not in any detectable way. The silence became oppressive, pressing against hulls and minds alike. Sensor operators reported nothing and less than nothing, a void where something should have been. The absence itself became a source of tension, a phantom limb of threat that could not be located or targeted. Biological unease rippled through the collective. Instincts screamed that blindness invited death. Memories of ancestral hunts resurfaced, of predators that feigned weakness only to strike when prey relaxed. Yet there was no strike. Time stretched and twisted, marked only by the slow drift of stars across fixed reference points. The humans endured the waiting with terrifying composure, their ships radiating nothing but the faint gravitational pull of existence. Chemical regulators struggled to suppress rising agitation among alien crews. This was not fear in the conventional sense. It was confusion weaponized by silence. The universe, as they understood it, responded to strength and signal. Silence belonged to ambushes and graves. And yet here it was, sustained, deliberate, absolute. The human flotilla had not merely reduced its profile. It had chosen to exist at the bare minimum required to remain alive, as if daring the cosmos itself to misinterpret them. The collective searched for precedent and found only one unsettling parallel buried deep in comparative xenology archives. Primitive species on the brink of extinction sometimes froze completely, reducing movement and sound to avoid detection by overwhelming predators. It was a last resort behavior, born not of strategy but of desperation. To see it employed here, by a starfaring civilization capable of vast power, shattered assumptions. Desperation did not fit the data. These humans were not cornered. They had options. They simply were not using them. The alien fleet tasted the human choice through subtle cues. Hull temperatures dropped. Electromagnetic noise fell away. Even the faint chemical signatures of life support systems were minimized. It smelled, in the abstract sensory language of their instruments, like winter and stone and old things buried deep. This was not the posture of a species eager to dominate. It was the posture of one refusing to escalate, even at profound risk to itself. Logic struggled to reconcile the act. If the humans were predators, they were discarding every advantage. If they were prey, they were not running. If they were irrational, their behavior was too consistent, too controlled. The only conclusion left hanging, unspoken and unwelcomed, was that the humans understood something the alien collective did not. That they recognized the opening movements of war so intimately that they chose to halt them at their own expense. In the darkness, human ships continued to drift, crews breathing recycled air in hushed compartments, trusting insulation, mathematics, and each other more than sensors or weapons. The vacuum carried no sound, but if it had, it might have echoed with the thunder of restraint. To the alien fleet, this restraint registered as error so vast it bordered on madness. To humanity, it was discipline learned the hard way. The void held them both, a stage stripped of spectacle, reduced to mass and silence. For the first time in their long, violent history, the alien collective faced an opponent that refused to play the expected role. And in that refusal, in that chosen blindness and quiet, something shifted. The darkness between the fleets was no longer merely the absence of light. It became a question, heavy and unanswered, about what kind of species could afford to turn off its eyes and still remain unafraid. Hours passed, not marked by clocks or signals, but by the slow creep of unease through alien neural lattices. Time became pressure. The battle algorithms continued their relentless work, branching into millions of predictive futures, each one demanding motion, deception, or violence to resolve uncertainty. They simulated ambushes that required sudden thrust and flaring engines. They modeled betrayals that depended on feints and false transmissions. They calculated attacks that demanded intent sharp enough to cut the void. Every scenario ended in action. None of those actions occurred. The humans did nothing. Their ships remained exactly where inertia had placed them, drifting on vectors chosen long before arrival. No drive signatures bloomed. No course corrections betrayed hidden agendas. The cold between the stars wrapped around human hulls and stayed there, undisturbed. To the alien fleet, this was maddening. Stillness without escalation violated every tactical framework they possessed. Waiting without probing was wasted potential. Silence without preparation was death. And yet the humans endured it. Alien processors ran hot, struggling to reconcile doctrine with observation. Threat models degraded under the weight of null data. Every second without movement eroded confidence in prediction. The silence was not passive, it was active resistance to interpretation. The algorithms demanded input, demanded noise, demanded behavior to dissect and counter. Instead, they were fed absence, and absence proved corrosive. Across the void, human vessels continued to exist at the bare minimum of detectable life. Hull temperatures stabilized at levels just above vacuum equilibrium. Insulation creaked softly as materials contracted, microscopic sounds trapped inside metal coffins drifting through endless dark. Within those hulls, hearts beat in steady, stubborn rhythms. Lungs drew recycled air that tasted faintly of metal and plastic and old breath. Muscles ached from enforced stillness. Eyes strained against dim emergency lighting, pupils wide, senses sharpened inward rather than outward. This endurance was not accidental. It was practiced. Humanity had learned, long before it reached the stars, that reaction was often the most dangerous choice. They had learned it in firestorms and sirens, in cities flattened by weapons launched in panic. They had learned it in bunkers and shelters, counting breaths while the world outside decided whether to end. That memory lingered, encoded not just in history, but in culture, in training, in the quiet confidence of crews who trusted restraint more than impulse. The alien fleet felt the cold logic of its own biology push toward resolution. Evolution demanded release. Predatory instincts itched for confirmation through violence. Chemical regulators flooded systems to maintain discipline, but the pressure mounted. The silence became a mirror, reflecting their own expectations back at them, exposing the raw assumption that every encounter must end in blood. The humans offered no such ending. They offered waiting. Sensor arrays continued to sweep, their emissions brushing against nothing and returning empty-handed. The absence of feedback gnawed at the collective mind. It felt like blindness, like staring into a void that refused to acknowledge the observer. The alien fleet had never faced an adversary willing to endure this level of vulnerability. Every known species guarded awareness like a sacred flame. To extinguish it voluntarily was unthinkable. To do so while remaining within striking distance bordered on insanity. And yet the humans remained. Within human ships, crews monitored passive indicators, trusting mathematics etched into hull stress tolerances and life support margins. They trusted that metal would hold, that trajectories would remain predictable, that the other fleet would not misinterpret restraint as invitation. More than that, they trusted one another. Trust flowed along shared training and shared memory, a quiet agreement that no one would flinch first. The cost of breaking that trust was understood without being spoken. Panic was contagious. Reaction was irreversible. The void carried no sound, but the tension felt loud. It pressed against alien hulls like phantom vibrations, a low-frequency dread that seeped into collective awareness. The longer the humans waited, the more alien certainty began to fracture. Their doctrine had no answer for an opponent who refused to confirm threat status. Every species they had ever encountered had chosen either aggression or retreat within predictable windows. The humans chose neither. They occupied a third state that alien cognition struggled to classify. Internal simulations began to drift. Probabilities flattened. The sharp peaks of expected outcomes blurred into unsettling plateaus. Without input, without movement, the models lost confidence. For the first time in generations, the alien fleet faced an encounter it could not optimize. The silence became not just an absence of sound, but an absence of control. Human endurance deepened the dissonance. Life support systems hummed quietly, cycling air and heat with ruthless efficiency. Frost formed along interior bulkheads where insulation thinned, tiny crystals glittering in low light. Breath fogged briefly before being reclaimed by filters. Time stretched into a test of patience and nerve. Humanity passed it not by bravado, but by acceptance. Waiting was not a tactic. It was a discipline. The alien collective began to register a subtle shift within itself. Fear, long honed into aggression, had nowhere to go. There was no target to strike, no signal to silence. The silence forced introspection, an uncomfortable examination of instinct stripped of justification. They had prepared to fight a war. They were being asked, by inaction alone, to consider peace without being offered terms. That thought did not yet form fully, but its shadow passed through the collective. The realization that the humans were not ignorant crept closer. Ignorance was chaotic, inconsistent. This was precise. This was controlled. This was a species choosing to absorb risk rather than project it outward. Such a choice implied experience with catastrophe so profound that restraint had become preferable to survival odds calculated through violence. As the hours continued to slip by, marked only by orbital drift and the slow turning of distant stars, the alien fleet felt something unfamiliar take root. Uncertainty was no longer external. It was internal, gnawing at assumptions once held as immutable truth. The universe had always rewarded readiness to strike first. That belief had guided them through countless encounters. Now it faced a contradiction embodied in silent, drifting human ships. The humans did nothing, and in doing nothing, they forced the galaxy's most battle-hardened fleet to confront the possibility that survival could be achieved through patience rather than dominance. This was not ignorance. It was restraint sharpened by memory, by loss, by the knowledge of how quickly reaction could turn into annihilation. The silence held, heavy and unbroken, and within it the balance of the encounter began to shift, not through force, but through endurance. Strain rippled through the alien collective like stress fractures spreading through crystal. What had once been a unified lattice of intent began to warp under its own weight. Evolutionary fears surged, ancient and chemical, demanding release through motion and violence. Yet every potential action now carried a cost no algorithm could confidently resolve. To fire into the silence risked awakening a response that had chosen patience over threat. To advance risked collapsing distance against an enemy that had deliberately surrendered every visible advantage. To retreat risked pursuit by a force that had proven it could wait longer than fear could endure. Internal control systems worked furiously to maintain cohesion. Neural regulators pulsed, flooding shared consciousness with stabilizing signals. Even so, divergence crept in. Subprocesses disagreed. Minority projections gained traction. For the first time since their species had emerged from its extinction eras, the collective experienced something dangerously close to doubt. The lattice of certainty, once rigid and flawless, flexed and groaned. The silent human fleet remained unchanged, an unmoving smear of mass against the starfield. No emissions bloomed. No weapons warmed. No signals leaked. Their presence pressed on alien perception like an unresolved equation, elegant and infuriating. If this silence was a trap, it was the strangest trap the collective had ever catalogued. Traps relied on deception, on misdirection, on bait that provoked pursuit. This offered nothing. It invited no advance and promised no reward. It merely existed, patient and exposed. If it was weakness displayed without fear. That contradiction cut deep. Every known species masked vulnerability, cloaked it in bluster or flight. Exposure invited predation. That was the rule written into galactic history and reinforced by countless annihilated civilizations. Yet here was a species that made vulnerability visible and remained unmoved by the threat of immediate destruction. The human ships drifted with hulls cold and dark, trusting distance and inertia rather than intimidation. Such behavior did not align with prey or predator. It suggested something else entirely. Alien analytical frameworks strained to adapt. New branches formed in logic trees once considered complete. They began to model not just tactical outcomes, but psychological intent. The silence was no longer interpreted as absence. It was interpreted as statement, a refusal to escalate. A deliberate pause at the threshold where misunderstanding turned into war. This realization did not arrive fully formed. It seeped in slowly, carried on the erosion of assumptions. The collective replayed historical data, not from other species, but from itself. It examined the opening moments of its own wars, the points where contact turned fatal. In every case, there had been a signal, a flare of energy, a surge of movement that confirmed fear and justified annihilation. Those moments were recognizable patterns, etched into instinct and memory. The humans were mirroring that recognition by stopping just short of them. Only a species intimately familiar with the opening moments of war could recognize them well enough to halt. That understanding spread, unsettling and profound. The humans were not ignorant of danger. They were fluent in it. They knew exactly how wars began because they had begun many. They knew the shape of escalation because they had survived it, again and again, at terrible cost. The silence was not hesitation. It was refusal. Within the alien collective, fear shifted its target. It no longer pointed outward alone. It turned inward, toward the possibility that their own instincts might be obsolete. They had survived by striking first, by overwhelming uncertainty with force. That strategy had never failed them because no one had ever challenged its premise. Now, faced with a species willing to endure the raw exposure of first contact without armor of threat, the premise cracked. The human fleet waited, and in that waiting revealed something deeply unsettling. They trusted restraint more than dominance. They trusted that the unknown might choose not to kill if given the chance. Such trust was irrational by every alien metric. It violated survival heuristics refined across millions of years. And yet it was being demonstrated relentlessly, without flinch or apology. Biological indicators within the alien fleet reflected the turmoil. Stress hormones spiked and receded in cycles. Neural activity patterns showed oscillation rather than convergence. The collective mind struggled to reconcile the demand for action with the absence of justification. Every simulated strike carried a growing probability of catastrophic regret, not because of immediate retaliation, but because of what that strike would represent. It would be the destruction of a choice freely offered. The idea of choice was foreign and heavy. War had always been framed as necessity, as inevitability enforced by fear and scarcity. The humans reframed it without words. By doing nothing, they demonstrated that the opening moments of war were not inevitable. They were decisions. Decisions that could be delayed. Decisions that could be refused. The alien collective felt something like vertigo. If war was a choice, then responsibility followed. Responsibility for every extinction they had justified as preemptive. Responsibility for every civilization erased under the logic of survival. The silence dredged up ghosts long buried under certainty. Attention returned again and again to the human ships. Their minimal heat signatures flickered faintly, steady and controlled. Life persisted inside them, fragile and stubborn. Those lives sat unarmed before the unknown, trusting not in superiority, but in shared restraint. Only a species that had survived its own worst instincts could dare such exposure. Only a species that had learned the cost of fear-driven action could choose stillness as defense. The collective began to understand that this encounter was not being won or lost through force. It was being endured. The humans were testing something deeper than weapon ranges or shield harmonics. They were testing whether the galaxy was capable of restraint. Fear still demanded action, but it was no longer blind. It was tempered by awe and a growing, reluctant respect. The alien fleet remained in formation, weapons ready but unfired, held in place not by doctrine alone, but by the weight of a new understanding. To strike now would not be survival. It would be surrender to instinct unchallenged. The silence stretched on, thick and absolute. Within it, an impossible realization took hold and refused to be dislodged. Humanity had reached the edge of war and chosen to stop. In doing so, they exposed a truth the galaxy had long avoided. The most dangerous species was not the one most prepared to strike first, but the one strong enough to choose not to. Weapon capacitors across the alien fleet began to cool, their stored fury bleeding away into controlled dissipation. It was not a cascade or a failure, but a deliberate unwinding of lethal readiness. Energy fields collapsed inward. Targeting solutions dissolved into dormant memory. The lattice of threat geometry loosened, angles softening by fractions that carried enormous meaning. In the vacuum, nothing announced the change, yet everything felt it. The tension that had stretched the space between fleets like a drawn filament finally eased, not snapping, but settling into a new and unfamiliar equilibrium. This was not surrender. It was recognition. The alien collective registered the shift with reverent caution. For the first time since contact, its internal signals aligned not around survival through dominance, but survival through acknowledgement. The silence between the fleets remained absolute, yet it was no longer empty. It carried weight now, dense with understanding. What had passed between them required no translation. Humanity had spoken without signal, without threat, without words, and the message had been received in full. Human vessels remained dark and still, unchanged by the subtle relaxation unfolding across the void. Their restraint had not been contingent on alien response. It had not been a gamble waiting for validation. It was a statement complete unto itself. The humans did not surge with triumph or relief. They continued to wait, hulls cold, reactors whispering, trusting that the choice they had made did not require immediate reward. Within the alien fleet, ancient instincts recoiled and recalibrated. Powering down weapons in proximity to an unknown force would once have been unthinkable. It violated everything written into their survival codes. Yet the act did not feel like exposure. It felt like relief. The constant pressure to preempt, to dominate, to destroy before being destroyed, loosened its grip. Fear did not vanish, but it transformed, shedding its sharpest edges. In its place emerged something rarer and more destabilizing than panic. Respect. The collective examined the moment from every angle, embedding it into shared memory even as it unfolded. This encounter would be studied for generations, not as a battle avoided, but as a confrontation endured. Humanity had answered fear with stillness and violence with patience, and in doing so had forced the galaxy to confront a long-ignored truth. The opening moments of war were not dictated by physics or fate. They were chosen. The vacuum bore witness, indifferent yet eternal. Distant stars burned with ancient light, unaware that a boundary had shifted beneath their gaze. In that frozen span of space, something unprecedented had occurred. A species known for its capacity to shatter worlds had chosen not to demonstrate it. Humanity's power was not hidden. It was implied by absence, by the quiet confidence of those who knew exactly what they were capable of and refused to prove it. The alien collective began to understand the deeper danger and promise embodied by the human fleet. This was not a civilization restrained by weakness or indecision. This was restraint forged in catastrophe. Humanity carried the scars of near self-destruction, etched into culture and consciousness. They had stood on the brink of annihilation inflicted by their own hands and stepped back. That experience radiated outward now, shaping their first steps into the wider galaxy. No alarms sounded. No banners unfurled. The recognition passed without ceremony, yet its impact rippled far beyond the unclaimed system. The alien fleet held position, weapons dormant, no longer postured for immediate violence. The silence persisted, but it had changed character. It was no longer the breath held before a strike. It was the space left open for possibility. Within human ships, crews remained at their stations, senses still tuned inward. Hearts continued their steady work. Breath fogged and cleared in recycled air. Muscles remained tense, not from fear, but from discipline maintained without release. Humanity did not celebrate. Celebration would have been premature. The choice to wait had not ended risk. It had simply transformed it into shared responsibility. The galaxy watched, in ways it could not yet articulate. Sensor ghosts and gravitational whispers carried the record outward. Observers far removed would later argue about when the balance of power truly shifted. Some would point to battles and treaties yet to come. Others would trace it back to this moment of mutual stillness, when the most aggressive fleet the galaxy had ever known powered down its weapons in response to silence. The alien collective did not mistake patience for pacifism. It understood, perhaps better than any other species, what violence humanity could unleash if provoked beyond restraint. That knowledge settled deep, not as a threat, but as a warning written in negative space. Humanity's strength was not just its capacity for destruction, but its ability to contain it. As time continued its quiet passage, the encounter resolved without spectacle. Trajectories diverged subtly. Distances increased by margins chosen with care. No pursuit followed. No sudden movements broke the fragile accord. The fleets disengaged not through retreat or advance, but through mutual acknowledgement that the first test had been passed. In the chronicles that followed, this moment would be dissected and mythologized. Some would claim it proved that empathy could temper evolution. Others would argue it was simply a strategic anomaly, unlikely to repeat. Yet the truth lay in the sensory reality of that silence. In the cold vacuum where weapons powered down without firing, the galaxy witnessed something rarer than firepower or faster than light travel. It saw a species that knew exactly how to destroy everything, and chose instead to wait. Humanity trusted that survival did not always belong to the first to strike. Sometimes it belonged to the one strong enough to remain silent, to endure fear without surrendering to it, and to offer restraint as the first and most dangerous gift. The universe, vast and uncaring, did not applaud. It did not need to. The change had already taken root, carried forward by memory, by recognition, and by the quiet understanding that from this moment on, first contact would never be approached the same way again.